Good evening. Thanks for joining us again tonight for our Sunday night service. Tonight's message is entitled, An Evil Agenda as Old as Time. What we're going to look at tonight is obviously scriptures, but also we're going to talk about the one world government and ID 2020. We need to be praying all the time about demonic spiritual forces at play in our nation's crisis. It's a fact that we live in a fallen world in the midst of a spiritual battle. The structures that operate within our world that are not empowered by a redemptive Christ are empowered by spirits of darkness. The fruit of some of these agendas, plans, and structures and organizations reveal the power spurring them on. So let's take a look at ideas and agendas behind the havoc that we are all witnessing in our nation. It is true that Satan is the first radical known to man. Rebellion is not only the original sin, but the sin that keeps in giving in our world today. Our world's history is filled with acts of rebellion, especially and primarily rebellion against God, which gives way to other spirits such as hate and greed and fear and violence and deception and more. The strategies that are described in a book that probably many of you are not familiar with, it is entitled Rules for Radicals, and it's authored by Saul Alinsky. And it is based on rebellion and on, believe it or not, honoring Lucifer. It supports philosophies and methods of radical thinking and acting, and that are playing out in America today on our streets in many of our U.S. cities. But the planning and the implementation of this type of strategy has laid out far before the explosive rioting that took place and before the tragic killing of George Floyd. The planning and implementation has been in the works for decades in our nation. Communism isn't dead. One of the most effective vehicles for societal disruption is the ideological system of communism. You see, the very foundation of communism is dependence on the state, which ensures control of the state. Power is centralized in an elite class of rulers. And the lie that people are told is that a governmental system, which is often sold by another friendly sounding name such as democratic socialism, that offers equality and freedom as well as a reward for the little guy. Not true. The lies start at the root of the communist ideology inception. You've probably heard of Karl Marx. He was born into a German Jewish turned Protestant family. Well, he became very enamored and influenced by the teachings of his atheist professor while at the Berlin University. And he learned about a society process when a new idea conflicts with an existing society. A greater, more meritorious society evolves. Maybe you've heard of Marx, who later co-authored the Communist Manifesto, describing religion as an opiate of the people, preventing evolution from the evil capitalism to be more emancipated system of communism. Remember this as I read this. Communism developed out of an atheist worldview, hostility toward religion, with the idea that revolution, in other words, a violent clash, brings about the next better system. And certainly we see today that at the universities and what they're teaching, these atheist professors breed rebellious ideas and ingrain them into our students and our kids in the colleges today. This isn't a recent phenomenon. It has happened for over 100 years. The problem is a lot of us have not been paying attention, or we are too scared to deal with it. It's also worth noting that Karl Marx was born a Jew and was an aggressive anti-Semite and racist, often writing hatefully about blacks and Jews. And the system he founded was steeped in prejudice. In fact, a quote from Saul Alinsky's Rule for Radicals says this: "Lest we forget at least and over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical, from all legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom goes by the name of Lucifer." You see, there is a plan. The coward Pavin strategy is the modern brainchild of two American students of Marxism. There was Richard Cloward and Francis Vox Pavin, and they moving a culture towards socialism and communism begins with this: orchestrate a crisis so the government can solve it. This is playing out in our nation right before our eyes. Let me give you the 4 steps of the Cloward-Pavin strategy, again from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Number 1, overload and break the systems. As I give you these 4, think about this. Number 2, have chaos ensue. Number 3, take control in the chaos. And number 4, implement socialism and communism through governmental force and control. You see, as we see these in operation today, what do we do as Christians? We should pray. We should intercede and pray against this, because the enemy is seeking to control and wrestle control, usurping our God-given freedoms, folks. In any Marxist society, the church is the enemy of the state. It is a natural outworking of a spiritual battle. So here is where I see that strategy applied. Let's think about this. If you're taking notes tonight, I would encourage you, if you're not, I'm going to give you 8 of them. Number 1, healthcare. Healthcare. Control healthcare, and then you can control the people. Number 2, poverty. Increase the poverty level, and poor people are easier to control and will not fight back when the government provides everything for them to live. Number 3, debt. Increase the debt to an unsubstantial level. That way you are able to increase taxes, and this will produce more poverty. Number 4, gun control. We've heard a lot about that recently. Remove the ability of the citizens to defend themselves from the government in order to create a police state. Number 5, welfare. Take control of every aspect of their lives, such as food and housing and income. Number 6, education. Take control of the schools and what people read and hear. Number 7, religion. Remove belief in God from government and schools. And last and not least, number 8, class warfare. You see, divide the people into wealthy and the poor. This will cause more discontent, and it will be easier to tax the wealthy with the support of the poor. These strategies are actually from Vladimir Lenin, and they are eerily consistent with the policies of the left and the governmental response currently, from what I see, to the coronavirus. You see, we as American Christians need to recognize and be praying, because there is a incremental transfer of power from personal responsibility over to the government control, and we need to speak out against this. John 3:20 says, "For everyone who practices evil hate the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds be exposed." Something else we can do. We need to pray about the spiritual roots of rebellion. Here are some prayer strategies for you to use to oppose the spirits that are going on in dark places with hidden dark agendas that we may see at work in our nation. We must address the issues we see by praying about the root and the power behind these manifestations. First thing that we need to be praying about is where there is chaos, pray for and act in the opposite spirit, which is peace and order. Where there is hate, pray for and act in the opposite spirit, love and tenderness towards others. Where there is division, pray for and act in opposite spirit, in unity and compassion. Where there is deception, pray and act in the opposite spirit, truth and transparency. Where there is fear, pray for and act in an opposite spirit, security in God and faith. And last but not least, where there is greed, pray for and act in opposite spirit, submission to God, contentment, and generosity. In Daniel 10 in the Old Testament, there's a whole chapter there that I want to encourage you to read. And in that chapter, we see that God's angel described the warring evil angels that come against the Lord's angels in the heavenlies, and that our prayers affect the spiritual war that is happening. You see, God has entrusted to us Christian spiritual power, and through His Holy Spirit at work in our redeemed lives, God instructs us, you and I, how to prepare for these spiritual battles by utilizing the armor of God. So the question is, so who is waging the war against our foundations? Organizations, let's talk for a moment about them. Organizations like Black Lives Matter. You see, this organization began out of anguish from George Zimmerman quite a while ago and Trayvon Martin. And it was those two situations and murders were a case to spotlight unlawful deaths of Black Americans. And after that, Black Lives Matter is actually, if you investigate them, a socialist-rooted organization. An accuracy in media report explains that Garza, Coolers, and Tometai all work for front groups. So that's what we need to know. Behind these groups are other dark agendas that are going on. Secondly, or number 2, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, abbreviation FRSO. one of the 4 largest radical left organizations in our country. And I bet half of us have never even heard that. The others are, number 3, the Communist Party USA, abbreviated CPUSA. Number 4, the Democratic Socialists of America, known as the DSA. And 5, or fifthly, Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, CCDS. Number 6, Nalini Stamps Acorn, ACORN. Now it's rebranded under a variety of different names and works with all 4 organizations. And number 7, Dream Defenders, which is backed by the Service Employees International Union, known as SEIU. Also, number 8, which most of us are probably familiar with, is the ACLU, which is the Southern Poverty Law Center and others, and the biggest benefactors to Black Lives Matter are progressive funders such as Ford Foundation, Tides Foundation, and George Soros. And last but not least, number 9, Antifa. We've heard that name a lot lately. Like the movements before them of Occupy, Indivisible, and Acorn, and Antifa seeks to make America ungovernable. And out of the chaos that we see going on is really the tactic that I talked about earlier, Cloward-Pavin strategy. A new and replacement system can then be pushed forth. And just a bunch of riotous young people with an axe to grind, you might be thinking? Hardly. You see, their cause is upheld and supported even by some national government officials. At the left, Minnesota Attorney General and former Democratic Chair Keith Ellison holds up an Antifa manual. You see, independent journalist Andy Nego has reported extensively about Antifa. He said Antifa is a extreme antichrist communist movement, has writing down to an art. You see, first they say in their manual of Antifa, go ahead and break a window, and that is the blood in the water for looters then to move in. And when the looting is done, the manual goes on to say, those carrying flammable chemicals start fires to finish the job. Footage recorded in Minneapolis, probably many of you saw that, and other cities show militants dressed in black bloc. You see, that is known as the Antifa uniform. And they're wielding weapons like hammers and sticks to smash windows. And you see their graffiti sprayed all over on the smashed up buildings. This man was attacked, Andy Nego, in Washington, D.C. by Antifa. He said the riots that we see that reach the gates of the White House, possibly the most secure location on earth, there they chipped away at the barriers piece by piece while law enforcement struggled to respond. One Secret Service agent officer reportedly had a brick thrown at his head, and footage recorded at the scene showed him blood-soaked. That worked for now. And the militants uprising across our country, they want a revolution. And they don't care who or what has to be destroyed in the process. You see, if their comrades die, they are elevated as martyrs in propaganda. Death is then celebrated amongst them. Their organization is key, Antifa. Breitbart reported that the protest observers, and probably many of us saw this on national TV, in Dallas, we saw multiple piles of bricks in areas where there was no construction going on. You see, the bricks were obviously put there, staged, in other words, ready for the protesters to use at their whim, easy access and hard to trace. Sadly, those who were peaceably protesting the killing of George Floyd were used by the radicals, and their gathering was co-opted to bring violence and hate. There's one last group to watch, known as RAM, the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement. You see, the Revolutionary Abolition Movement, with their tagline, "Burn down the plantation," advocates self-governance instead of civil authority structures in place today, as well as the abolition of gender. It is interesting to note that the connection of racial struggle with the LGBTQ ideology and agenda. The manifesto of the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement can be found here. It decentralized with regional groups at varying levels of organization, and there is no listing of their leadership. We need to pray for people who are involved in these groups. We need to pray that they will have their eyes opened and that they would experience the love of the Father and the transformation of their hearts through the power of Christ. And we need to pray that they would be set free, as many of us have been. You see, there are tactics to overthrow the Judeo-Christian principles of America. What is unique about the founding of our nation is the acknowledgement by the framers of the hand of God at work and the biblical principles woven into the founding documents and structures. America has fought a constant and concerted effort to minimize, discount, and discredit the God-honoring framework of our nation. Here are tactics of the radicals in their own words. Have you ever seen these used in our nation? I want you to think. Number one, control the language. You see, in a war of words, you can control the language by redefining the issue or reframing the debate, and then you'll win. How many times have new and more pleasant words replaced terms of evil in our culture? Pro-choice and reproductive rights, not pro-abortion. Sexual freedom, not perversion. Orwell wrote in his book in 1984, he said, "But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." You see, this has been one of the most challenging yet successful tactics of progressives. Look how our culture has changed meanings. You see, perception of certain concepts just because of controlling the way things are talked about. Pro-choice instead of pro-abortion. Migrant instead of illegal alien. You see, this is how we get an upside-down view. What is right and what is wrong. And it is unsettling because the Bible talks about it in Isaiah 5:20. It tells us, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Number two, organizing for action. One of the main ways to effect change is through organizing. You see, radicals and progressives are masterful organizers. Funding these groups are an army of titans and foundations that provide the backing these groups needs to carry out these revolutionary ideals. Black Lives Matter and Antifa were groomed and funded and ready to employ at the opportune time when they could make the biggest splash. They are trained in violence and have been described as run like a business. Add a willing media to promote their earnest cause, and they have endeared themselves to the uninformed. Third, or number three, shape education. It is not a coincidence that the changing standards and principles of education has contributed to a post-Christian culture in America. Our public schools took away their God, which left them with no one to whom they should be accountable. Philosophies that have evolved in our nation were prevalent in our modern education system. In fact, the American education system goes back to the first public schools. You see, I attended a middle school named after a man by the name of Horace Mann. And little did I know, all these years later, that Horace Mann created the first public school in order to remove students from the religious influence and teachings of their parents. Public schools are still doing that today. Mann was not the only one. John Dewey, known as the father of modern education, he was a self-proclaimed socialist who had disdain for the Christian faith. Dewey hated the American independent mindset and sought social evolution in education. His prolific writings continue to influence education, and he remains one of the most influential educators in America even today. And the foundation of Marxism birthed from the teaching of an atheist professor. Interesting. You see, we are in a fight for the future of our nation. Ask the Lord how you and I might direct our prayers and then act. Let us be like the men of Issachar and who discerned the times they prayed and then they took action or they acted. Found in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32. You see, prophecies foretell of a time in the near future when every person will be required to have a universally recognized unique identification number in order to participate in society. The compulsory numbering system will be in the early stages of this system, receiving a number that will seem harmless. It will be just another number, unlike a debit card or Social Security numbers, and it will just be used to function in everyday life. For instance, most nations currently function under a national ID system, which allows their citizens to access to government subsidies and financial transactions and health care and insurance, etc. Only the Antichrist assumes full control of the world government. This numbering system will be turned into a method of control. Now, I know most people don't want to hear this. Most people probably don't believe this. You see, judging by the current moves towards a cashless society, it is like that by then most purchases will be made digitally as We've been getting prepared for that. We all use Amazon. We all go on the computer and buy stuff. And everyone will rely on their particular number for even the most basic essentials. That's what we really never see or think about. Because without it, no one will be able to legally buy or sell anything. In order for an individual's number to remain active, he or she will be forced to worship and pledge an allegiance to the Antichrist and the system of the Antichrist. And according to Scripture, this is the exact individual economic sanctioning model that will be used by the Antichrist to force the world into compliance to his global economic structure. Read with me what prophecy says in Revelations 13, verses 16 through 18. It says, "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. Then his number is 666, which in other versions reads 666. What we need to notice is that the Antichrist will cause the small, the poor, and the bond to receive the mark as well. And until I had begun my research for this message, I had never focused on this particular part of the prophecy. You see, the poor and the bond will have nothing to offer the Antichrist, but it is not their money that he is after. You see, it is all about a dependency or an adherence to his system, to his allegiance, and to absolute control. A form of worship, if you will. That's it. You see, the peak of his reign over the world government, the Antichrist will see absolute compliance to his system as a mode of worship to him. Just look at how closely prophecy aligns with many of the global numbering systems being proposed in our society today. We are currently seeing precursors to the system forced on indigent people around the globe. For instance, the Central African Republic is claimed to be one of the poorest nations on earth, with a per capita income of about $640 US. That was back in 2015. And many of them rely on the aid for survival in some of the harshest living conditions on earth. However, they are told that the lack of a national identification card will keep them from being recognized and disqualifies them from obtaining formal employment and blocks any and all social service benefits and development schemes. You see, these people are really destitute, and they are unable to give anything in return for assistance. But in order to be protected by the government in a war from a war-torn country, to be granted just like the basic needs of society, they are required to have a number. Why? Because governments know the only reason to number people is to track and control them. Although there are others, I want to focus on just one particular international numbering project currently being proposed to include the poorest individuals on earth. You see, these folks probably do not fully grasp or understand what a venture like this could lead to. However, for those who understand prophecy, this endeavor, or one similar to it, could be laying the groundwork for the future global numbering system of the Antichrist. Let me tell you about something called the Substantial Development Goals. Remember that, SDG, and it's in plural form. You see, the Sustainable Development Goals were unanimously adopted by 103 member states of the United Nations, including the United States, on September 25th, 2015. The goals make up the international community's 15-year socialistic blueprint of global governance for every person on Earth. And interestingly named Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the goal is a universal policy agenda designed to convert the nations of the world into a global governed by the United Nations. You see, the agenda is comprised of 17 main goals, accompanied by 169 focused targets designed to manage the planet, essentially. I'm not going to give you all 17 of those, but if you don't believe me, go to the internet and type in Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I say socialistic because the plan includes the socialistic principle of wealth redistribution, stating that the reduction of inequality will only be possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Of course it does. Bernie Sanders and a bunch of other socialist agenda people want to change the USA for the worst, forever. You see, I refer to it as the global governance of every aspect of every person on earth, since the plan states exactly this. Read along with me. We commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. Governments, international organizations, the business sector, and other non-state actors and individuals must contribute to changing unsustainable consumption and produce patterns. That's a quote from their own message on transforming our world. You see, the propaganda is that humans are using the earth resources at such a rate that nothing will be left for future generations. And therefore, the United Nations, world government, must establish a master plan to govern all of Earth's citizens. It must, number one, in true socialistic form, redistribute the wealth so that everyone is considered equal. How much have we heard about that in the last couple of years? Number two, control the production and consumption of every person. Number three, strive to achieve universal health care. I know we haven't heard anything about that lately. Trick. Number four, control the climate. Yeah, I think we did hear a thing or two about that. And number five, manage our cities and infrastructure. Number six, govern the oceans. And number seven, govern land usage along with the ecosystem. These are the Sustainable Development Goals, And this is world government. The problem is the administration of that plan. In other words, how is it going to be implemented? What is the old saying? You can't manage what you can't measure. You see, consider the size even of that effort. There are approximately 7 billion people on Earth today. Target 8 of their goal, number 3, is to achieve universal health care. Let's just talk about that. How do you roll out such a system and monitor it effectively? You can't go by a name. There are tens of thousands of John Smiths in the United States alone, just to think about it. You see, and that is why the only conceivable solution to track the administration of this plan is to ensure that every human has a unique identification number. Pay attention. Under the sustainable goals are goal 16.8 and 16.9, transforming our world, remember? The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, their preamble states this, and I quote, "Does it sound familiar? As we embark on this collective journey," that's global government, "we pledge that no one will be left behind." Goal 16, Target 8 and 9 of Sustainable Development Goals both strive to include every person on Earth in the ever-expanding global governing system of the United Nations. Goal number 16.8 states this, and I quote, "Broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries of institutions of global governance." 69 states that by 2030 provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. So in order for the elite of the world and this system to establish a true global government, in their mind, it must include every single person on Earth. It makes no difference if they live in a jungle or exist in the slums of an inner city or make up the poorest of the poor. One can understand the desire to want to help the poor. We can offer to give them a bowl of soup or provide a bath or a place to sleep for the night or even a new pair of shoes. It's simply the right thing to do. But the problem is forcing to receive legal identification papers or identification number in order to gain access to some of these provisions. You see, there are major efforts being made to implement these sustainable development goals by supplying the poorest people on the planet their own very unique identification number. Why? They claim that refugees or migrants and the poor must have that identification in order to identify themselves. And global governance is the driver. You see, my friends, in the beginning, this numbering system will look like an investment in the future of the poor. But in the last days, the Antichrist will be used as a method of control. And I'm just saying, think about it, okay? Maybe some of you out there have heard about ID 2020. In May of 2016, the first ID 2020 summit was held at the United Nations headquarters in our own United States in New York City. The summit brought together 400 people from the 150 different private sector companies and 11 UN agencies to discuss how to provide a unique digital identity to everyone on the planet, including 1.5 billion people living without any form of recognized identification. If you don't believe me, go to the internet and type in ID 2020. Look at some of the companies. Think about this, folks. Wake up. That were in attendance at this particular meeting. Bloomberg, Brigham Young University, Cisco Systems, Cornell University, Ernst & Young, Forbes, Google, IBM, JP Morgan, and last and not least, Microsoft, Bill Gates, and NASDAQ. You see, the two main outcomes from that meeting were, number one, widespread consensus among ID 2020 attendees that identify that both a fundamental human right and a necessary prerequisite before the success of sustainable development goals, and two, sweeping commitments from conference attendees to contribute towards the shared goal of universal digital identity. Did you catch that? You see, the world government, known as the UN today in our society, views a universal digital identity as an absolute necessary for the success of their global governing scheme to transform the world by 2030. You see, ID2020.org answers the question for all of us. Maybe you have that question tonight. Why identity? You see, a fundamental human right. Article 6 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights stipulates that everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. And Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 to 2030 include Target 16.9, which states and aims to provide legal identity, including birth registration, as I mentioned before. You see, necessary to access basic services. Individuals are required to show identification to access health care and education and vote and access other social assistance programs. How about critical for accountability and governance? Governments without an accurate system of identification struggle to provide well-coordinated social services, simply because the number of beneficiaries is unknown and precise targeting is impossible. And without clear registries, the risk of leakages and corruption are high. In fact, in Nigeria, enrollment of civil servants saved approximately, they say, $74 million by eliminating ghost workers on payroll. Another one is a gateway to economic opportunity. More than 2.5 billion adults do not have a bank account. We probably never thought about it because it's normal to us. Or use a formal financial service, which makes it difficult to move out of poverty and weather a period of hardship. You see, connecting people with digital financial tools and services requires accessibility, secure, and a verifiable ID system, which is important for gender equality. You see, women with an official identity are empowered to play a greater role in the household decisions and maintain financial independence. Furthermore, identification can be an important defense against child marriage, exploitation, and trafficking. but the key enabler of global development. In addition to the intrinsic benefit of identity, is a necessary prerequisite for achieving many of the other SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. International goals will be difficult to reach or measure without a way to identify the beneficiaries. Let's pause for a moment, because I want you to notice now the similarities of the ID 2020 project and the prophecy that is found again back in Revelations 13, verses 16 through 18. And he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand and in their foreheads, and that no man may buy or sell save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of the name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast. It is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Or as in some versions, the number 666. Now I want you to consider with me a few things as we begin to wind down. I want you to consider the explanation that is provided by ID 2020 project for the identification for every person on the earth. Number one, this is what they say. It is necessary to access basic services such as healthcare and education, as well as other social assistance programs. 2, critical accountability and governance. 3, access to a bank account. And 4, legal identity is necessary for implementation of at least 10 sections of the Sustainable Goals, social protection floors, including the most vulnerable, assistance in dealing with shocks and disasters, equal rights to economic resources, including property and finance. You see, we should be able to discern as Christians how important it is to the world government or the UN that every person on earth is given their own unique identification number. And without that numbering system, it would be virtually impossible to fully implement and monitor their sustainable development goals. You know why? Because it's all a big lie. I want to talk to you as I close up about a global identity system. Maybe some of you know a little bit about this. You see, the effort to establish a new universal identity database is the goal behind ID 2020. And that is why John Edge, the co-founder of the global initiative ID 2020, recruited the help of the United Nations agencies such as the NGOs and technology companies and the banks to see if they would come up with a solution by 2020. I want to talk to you, most people, and don't feel bad because I didn't know what it meant. Blockchain technology. How many of you even know what blockchains are? I didn't. And so I had to go investigate it. According to Huffington Post, one of the most intriguing and radical ideas is a new kind of identity system based on blockchain technology, which could bring together disparate programs to create a new universal identity database. Blockchains, which first helped account and authenticate Bitcoin cryptocurrency, are decentralized ledgers that track transactions of digital assets, whether it's currency or whether it's stocks or whether it's bonds or identity details. You see, the network is made up of a chain of computers, each of which has a copy of the ledger and can see if changes have occurred. Blockchains are thought to be secure because all computers must verify and approve each transaction as it takes place. A hacker, they say, couldn't get to every single computer. So with the identity blockchain, individuals would store their data in sort of a locker or escrow account, allowing people to access it on a need-to-know basis. This system is seen as a great advantage to refugees and migrants, since they would no longer be reliant on national governments for a legal identity. According to Coexist, the exact details of how a new global identity system would work are still to be worked out. But Dakota Gruner, ID 2020's executive director, imagines that it would evolve into a database overseen by an international, non-aligned organization like the United Nations. It would be flexible enough to encompass every country's existing rules and structures, but accessible to individuals with their own smartphones. Think about this, folks. Patrick Spence, a blockchain consultant with the accounting and consulting firm PwC in London, imagines that multiple commercial custodians would play different roles, and indeed there are several startups already offering blockchain-based identity services such as ShowCard and Blockstack. Still, there are significant barriers to establishing a universal ID system. A global ID protocol would be needed, like HTTP is to web or SMTP is to email. And without a large global institution like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund taking charge of this, startups are going to remain just that, startups. But yet at the same time, national governments would have to agree to give up some control over ID making, passing the power onto the network and to individuals. What is clear is this, that the current system of nation-based ID isn't serving a large number of people yet. And even when people are identified, their records are open to abuse by officials. But I want you to notice these two things. Again, the global identity system would evolve into a database that is overseen by an international, non-aligned organization like the UN. Remember this, folks. Number two, that the establishment of a universal ID system has many hurdles yet to cross. And without that large global institution like the UN or that monetary fund, the IMF as is known, those startups are just startups. But both parties recognize the need for a universal numbering system overseen by world government. I'm just saying, could this be the mark of the beast? According to Patrick Spence, ID 2020 is a global strategic initiative under the guise of helping to deliver against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of legal identification of all. And oh, by the way, is it possible that ID 2020 could be successful in creating the universal ID structure, including the small, the great, the poor, the free, and the bond, which could someday be taken over by the future world tyrant known as, biblically, the Antichrist? You see, at this point, we cannot say for sure whether the efforts of ID 2020 will result in a global numbering system that will one day be used by the Antichrist. This is what we know. The Bible prophesies that a world government will be established, and in the near future, which will be ruled by the Antichrist. And once the Antichrist assumes control, he will use this global numbering system to economically sanction every person on earth to conform to his dictatorial edicts. And as I close, by the way, look at the computer about what's going on June 21st. Yeah, this month, this year. IntelliHub says the Luciferian March for a one world government will be held in at least 9 U.S. cities on June 21st during a solar eclipse. And the marches are intended to create chaos, and it has been speculated by some that demonstrators may even try to erect satanic monuments at existing sites where Confederate and other alleged racist statues have been torn down. Most of the protests will take place in state capitals at the following cities: Jacksonville, Florida; Raleigh, North Carolina; Cincinnati, Ohio; Columbus, Ohio; Washington, D.C., Madison, Wisconsin; Buffalo, New York; Niagara Falls, New York; and yes, I believe the headquarters of satanic and witchcraft and all the rest, Salem, Oregon. You see, and if that wasn't enough to maybe get our attention a little bit, there is a rare solar eclipse that is supposed to, on June 21st, create a ring of fire in the sky. The solar eclipse, June 2020 date and time in India, says the first solar eclipse of the year 2020 will occur this month, also on June 21st, and the event will be an annular solar eclipse where the moon will cover the sun from the center, leaving the outer rim only visible, thus creating a ring of fire. Is it possible that ID 2020 could be successful in creating this universal identity structure, including all, the small, the rich, the great, the poor, the free, the bond, which could someday be taken over the future tyrant by the Antichrist? I say, yes, it is absolutely possible. But now we need to pray. So, Father, I pray in Jesus' mighty name that you, the God of heaven and all of earth, Father, by your mighty power, that, Lord, you would empower your people to resist the methods of the enemy, Satan, the devil. I pray, God, that you help us as Christians to pray for those, Lord, that are blinded by spiritual darkness. They're just being used by people and agendas behind the scenes. I pray, God, that, Father, you would enlighten them, that you would give them spiritual wisdom, that, Lord, you would help them to confess their sins, to admit they're sinners, to believe in you, and, Lord, to trust in you with all their life, that you wouldn't just, they wouldn't just come to you to give their life to you and escape from hell, Lord, but you would become Lord of their life. And that, Lord, they would have a deep desire to live for you and to spread the good news. And so, Father, as Christians tonight, we pray all these things in Jesus' mighty name. We all agreed by saying, amen.